entrepreneurship, leadership, and free market capitalism. You are listening to Kill Bigger Radio with Kyle Keegan.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am so unbelievably excited to introduce our guest for today. I was introduced to his work only last week when a fellow forum member posted a YouTube video in response to one of my show episodes. It did not take me long to realize our messages are very similar. I immediately decided to have him on the show. Thankfully, scheduling was easy, so here we are less than a week later making this happen. Our guest today is a 5-time champion public speaker. He has written at least 10 successful books that I have counted. His YouTube channel is loaded with gold. He is frequently asked to give keynote lectures to large companies. Bottom line, his message resonates. I am pleased to introduce our guest, Douglas Kruger, to the Kill Bigger Radio Show.
We have different accents, but similar thought patterns. It's a great pleasure to be with you, Kyle.
Man, thank you so much. I'm so excited to have you here. I have just been on an absolute crunch of getting through so much of your content because I'm just fascinated by what you have to say and how similar we are. And I was listening to a couple of things at the gym yesterday, and it was just fantastic, man. I'm just so glad to have you here. I've been excited about this. You're my first guest in a while. To start things off, can you tell the listeners more about your message, your background, your business, and what kind of brought you here? Like, how did this all happen? What made you this?
Yeah, so I work as a professional speaker and author, and what I've tried to do in all of my content is to chase down ideas that I've been curious about myself. So the background story to that one is I grew up in a family that lived in a relatively sort of middle to upper class neighborhood, but we were in many ways the odd ones out. And for generations, my family had struggled financially, and it put me in this strange and interesting position where you are observing the family struggle on one side and the prosperity on the other. And it's the little things that give you away. I mean, we in South Africa, we have a very similar school system to the British approach, which means that the school kids wear blazers and very formal outfits. And when you start school, you have a blazer that's sort of a few centimeters too long for your arm, and then a couple of years later, it's too small because it's the same one. And you're sort of surrounded by a degree of affluence and wondering what the difference is between why your family is struggling and why other people are making it. And the first book that I ever wrote on wealth was the answer to that question, written in a sense to me in my early 20s. It's everything that I wished I had known at the time.
Interesting. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So things like these families who get caught in generational cycles of poverty tend very much to have an external locus of control. And what I mean by that is they will look around them for who is doing this to us. And it's incredibly tempting to look for an external enemy, an external agency that is doing this to you. And I think possibly the first great mental revelation I ever had about this topic was the switch to an internal locus of control, in which you say, this is us. This is the sum total of our decisions, our approach to life, how we think and what we do. That was perhaps the first and most simple idea. And the complexity of ideas increases beyond that point. But whenever I speak or write or think or coach on the topic today, that is always the starting point. Because if you can't get people past that one hurdle, you can't go very much further. The opposite of that one is to say something like, the government must. And there are some profound reasons for believing that that's about the worst thing that can possibly happen.
Yes, absolutely. I've gone so far on this show, I know you're new to my stuff as well. I've gone so far on this show to call an external locus of control a character flaw. And I have to say, if you count up all of the bad employees that I've ever had, all of the bad employees, my wife is an entrepreneur as well, all of the bad employees that my wife has had, and me as a very strongly internal locus of control, I feel like I can see that from a mile away, right? I can see that type of belief system a mile away. And I have to say, had I just given them a locus of control quiz to begin with, I would have rooted out every negative, every toxic employee I would have ever had in any of my companies. How crazy is that?
Absolutely. And it's astonishing to see how far this goes in every direction. I mean, it's such a simple little switch to make, but it changes belief systems. It changes politics, it changes how you approach your wealth, it changes everything. We have a quite an interesting situation. I mean, I live in South Africa, and I was young when we were coming out of the apartheid system, which was in fact a very oppressive system to the majority of the country. And it has become extraordinarily easy for politicians in this country, a quarter of a century later, to continue to cite that and to blame that and to invite victimhood mentality. And of course, there's a degree of truth in the sense of this really was a victim creating structure. Now, here's the interesting thing about that belief system. Whether you believe that you are a victim of the past or whether you believe that you are the determinant of your own future, either way, you're correct. You are going to create that self fulfilling prophecy that changes how you go about your life. Unfortunately, though, there is much more incentive for politicians to focus on that than there is to actually give truthful answers, to simply speak the truth and to genuinely empower people to take charge of their own lives.
Yeah, when was it ever in a politician's best interest to empower people to take charge of their life? They want to keep you in that victim place, you
Yeah,
know?
absolutely. And Dr. Thomas Sowell from your nation is one of my sort of
Oh, he's
intellectual heroes on this
fantastic.
one.
Yes.
He absolutely outstanding. In fact, my one of my past books is dedicated to him. And after a sort of a couple of lines of praise, I say, if I could get the world to read your books, how great the difference would be. And his take on it, as you're familiar with, is he says we continually fall for the promise, the kindly sounding intention, but we never check the outcome. And if we check the outcomes, we would have an entirely different take on the thing. In fact, I have a new book coming out in January in which I cite some of that kind of thinking and the interaction between politics and wealth. And I talk about it this way. I say, imagine you walked into a mall or a store and you picked up a can of soup. And what would your expectations be when you opened that can of soup? Your expectation would be that you're about to open it and find a viscous colored liquid with a pleasant spicy aroma. And when you pour it out into your bowl, it's going to do what it says on the can. And I then say, as compared to a can of government program, it has certain statements on the can, but when you open it up, it doesn't do what it says on the can. But the problem is we never check, and we fall for the kindly sounding programs over and over. It's just the most fascinating thing to watch playing out in the real world.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we were even saying it just before I rolled the record button on the show was the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Good
That's kind of what
intentions, yeah.
the entire problem is with the foundation of these belief systems, which is just crazy. A quick question for you before we move on. Do you think it is possible for somebody to be able to overcome that external locus of control and become an internal locus of control?
Yes, it absolutely is. It is, however, and I think we have to concede this, immensely difficult to do. If you have been raised in what we might call a thought community that does that, it really does take some strength of thought and strength of character to change that belief system. And in fact, this is why in a couple of my books, I actually make the very challenging and difficult point where I say, if you are surrounded by nothing but that kind of thinking, it may actually be necessary for you to physically remove yourself from it. And that's where I take a moment of honesty with the reader and I say, I understand I'm talking about your family, your community, the reality in which you have grown up. And I then go on to say, this is not to say that you are rejecting these people, that you in any way have ceased to value them. It is to say that you are voting for yourself for something better. And it is immensely difficult to think differently to the people immediately around you. And I then make the very simple point that most people study the thinking of the people immediately around them. But what you will get from that is precisely the same results. The more useful or fruitful approach is to study the thinking at the level economically above you. How do those people think differently? And if the number one thing that they're telling you is internal locus of control, well, perhaps it's worth paying attention to that.
Yeah, I do agree. I think the internal locus of control, it just paints this divide when you start to look at these statistics. And I'll send you these statistics because you'll probably be fascinated by what I was reading, or perhaps you've seen them yourself.
Yeah.
But on your first video ever that I came across, you mentioned a Ferrari. And I want you to just talk about that story. That is a fantastic story. And it really just highlights this divide in belief system.
Yes. So over the years, I've progressed to thinking and speaking and writing about what I call the difference between the truth and political correctness. Most people think that political correctness exists on one side of a spectrum, and on the other side of the spectrum is something like meanness or rudeness or a lack of civility.
Meanness.
My argument is, just you're just an outright awful person. My argument is that it doesn't work that way. I believe political correctness exists on one side of a spectrum, and on the other side is speaking the truth. And meanness or civility, kindness or the lack of manners can be applied at any point, whether you are being politically correct or whether you are speaking the truth. Now, this has become quite a refined area of thinking for me some 20 years down the line. But the very first time I saw it in action was driving down a sort of a country lane in my area, and it's this what we call the wedding mile. So it's all these beautiful wedding venues and rolling hills all around, absolutely breathtakingly beautiful area. And I came upon an accident between a Ferrari, brand new model at the time, although you could only tell it from the badge. The rest of the car was pretty crumpled up.
Oh man!
And a VW, what we would call a Volkswagen. We pronounce it the German way, a VW Golf, which is a little hatchback. And these two cars were both totaled on the side of the road. And as a car lover myself, I mean, I've always had a great admiration for beautiful cars. I put a little message on social media where I said, this accident between a Golf and a Ferrari, and I said, a minute of silence for the mighty fallen. And what then took me, and this was absolutely fascinating, were the comments from my friends on social media. You would swear that the Ferrari driver had been caught embezzling funds or kicking puppies. He was the devil incarnate. There had never lived a more evil man than the Ferrari driver. And what was fascinating about that was that I had not stated, nor did I know, who was at fault in that particular case. We can probably go on some faith that the Ferrari driver did something silly with the amount of power available to him, but we don't know. I can certainly testify that Golf drivers in my area do some pretty crazy things as well. Hot hatches are a big deal here, and I can easily see a guy in a hot hatch trying to take on a Ferrari in a mouse barking at an elephant kind of way. Either way, we have no idea. Nobody knows what actually happened. I mean, we could have had a dog run across the road. We don't know.
Right.
But the level of visceral hatred aimed at this Ferrari driver was breathtaking. And what it amounts to is he was guilty by virtue of wealth. And the more I started looking around for that, the more of it I saw, this kind of sour grapes thing that it's not just an envy of the life of a wealthy person. It is genuine hatred. And there's a British commentator, a very, very famous man in the UK called Jeremy Clarkson. And he said, it's different in
I'm
the
a fan.
UK
I know Jeremy Clarkson. I know
you know Jeremy
him.
Clarkson, Top Gear and the whole
yes,
trip.
absolutely.
Yeah. Now, here's an interesting question. This may have changed in the last sort of 15 years or so. But at the time, his observation was, in the USA, we watch a guy go past in a beautiful car, and we say, one day, I want to be in a car like that. He says, in the UK, it's different and more bitter. He says, we watch them go by and we think, one day I'll have him out of that car.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I do believe that it has changed. Here in the United States, we have moved away from the traditional values that America was built on, that I'm sure a lot of people like you around the world really came to respect, was that individualism versus collectivism, right? Right. Everybody is involved in a mutually beneficial value exchange to improve their own condition, right? That's the fundamental basis of true capitalism, right? And the difference is now they have that similar belief system. They believe that wealthy people just did it because they got lucky. They believed potentially if they weren't lucky, they were dishonest, right? Or if they weren't dishonest, they're just being greedy. They're hoarding everything for themselves. And the funny thing is, when you really look at the data, they have a supporting lifestyle that created that, right? Versus a poverty lifestyle, a supporting lifestyle that creates poverty, which is it's very interesting. But more and more people are getting that poverty mindset. More and more people are following this level of political correctness, as you would say, down that road, and they want to be a good person. They want a virtue signal. They want to be all part of, what everybody says is the good thing. And then the problem that occurs thereafter is a slight and consistent move towards like a Marxist system.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, just to back that up, some research that I've done recently points out that the world's most giving, most philanthropic nation is the United States of America. Nobody gives more money than the USA. To which the socialist response tends to be, well, sure, it's a bigger economy. To which I then respond that in terms of hours donated to charitable causes, the United States also ranks in the top 3. Now, let's do a little contrast. If you have to take the nations of the world and ask the simple question, who is the least charitable nation? For 2020, the answer is socialist China. And in the bottom 10, you're going to find the former socialist nations of the Soviet Union. So there's always this kind of social justice talk that says capitalism is selfish and socialism is unselfish. It's the giving system. By no metric is that true. And of course, I think the most dangerous phrase is the one that all audiences will complete for me without even thinking. I'll stand on a stage and I'll say, complete the phrase, the rich are getting richer and everybody shouts, and the poor are getting poorer. And implied.
I can't believe you made them do that.
Oh, absolutely. I make them do worse than that. I mean, that's just to get them warmed up. But implied in that phrase is the idea the rich are getting richer because the poor are getting poorer. It's the zero-sum game mentality that says there is only so much to go around, and if one group is getting rich, it's because the other group is getting poor. Now, here's why that is factually impossible. If you start in the year 1980, some 45, I think it's 44 or 45% of the world was living beneath the poverty line. Now, that's a very recent metric in human history, as recently as 1980. Some 30 years later, that had dropped down to 14% of the world's population. And in the last 10 years, just 10 years, prior to the anomaly of the coronavirus lockdowns, we took some 1 billion people out of poverty. Now, it is not possible for the rich to be getting richer and the poor to be getting poorer, and those poverty trends, which are toward the disappearance of poverty, all to be true at the same time. Someone is lying. And essentially what it comes down to is the real picture goes like this. The rich are getting richer at a remarkably rapid rate, and the poor are getting richer too, just not as quickly. Now, here's where the problem comes in the discussion. We twin two ideas that should not go together. We talk about solving poverty and inequality. You can do one of those, but you can't do both simultaneously. And I think the false metric is the second one, where we say the differential between people. If you fundamentally have freedom, then the differential is irrelevant. Two people, the relationship between two different people and their wealth does not matter. The question is, are poor people getting richer? And the answer is yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I've looked at the income inequality argument, and I always thought to myself, well, I mean, even if you go back 50 years, and I don't know how it's been in South Africa, I have no idea. But in the United States, you had one car per family. You didn't really go on vacations, but maybe once every 5 years. It was a
cost
big
of living
saving
and quality
thing.
of life.
Yeah, it's really more of a standard of living, a zest for life that is really the true measurement versus the argument of who has the most currency, right? Because if you go back 100 years, 150 years, they didn't even have running water. The rich didn't even have running water, right?
Absolutely.
And if you start to compare that, well, America's poor today is really more rich in lifestyle than the very richest people on Earth 150 years ago.
Go back 100 years, and even wealthy people got their feet wet and cold when they went to the bathroom in the middle of the night.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, it's a vastly different picture. And in fact, it's interesting to look at it nation by nation. You mentioned South Africa. We are in a sense going slowly backwards. We've had 25 years of a very socialist, vaguely Marxist government. And we're often compared to other developing nations like India, Brazil, and so on and so forth. Now, sadly, we are the odd ones out, and it is simply because we are following these kinds of policies. Our talk about wealth starts with the words the government should, which is the wrong place to start,
Yes.
and includes terminology like redistribution, which scares off rich people who simply leave. Now, by contrast to that, India has been skyrocketing. I mean, their economic development has been astronomical over the last 20, 30 years. And if you look into the history of it, post colonialism, the first thing they did, their government put in even more stringent controls than did the British colonialists prior to that. They referred to them locally as the Raj laws, and they increased poverty dramatically. Then, slowly but surely, what they began to do was they repealed these laws, they repealed the legislation, they made it unnecessary for an entrepreneur to go and beg government for permission to start a business. They got rid of all of it. And to the extent that they have been releasing their people just to do business, they have been skyrocketing. Now, we're doing the exact opposite. I mean, just one metric there. Our freedom to do business ranking on the Freedom to Do Business Index has been dropping year by year. In other words, it's getting harder and harder to do business here. Similar story if you look at New Zealand. They had one of the tightest sets of regulations in the developed world. In 1950 something, they were the third wealthiest nation on earth. Then they did that to themselves. They became one of the poorest. Then under a man named Roger Douglas, they call it now Rogernomics, they repealed everything and they shot right back up to being one of the wealthiest nations in the world. We know how to solve this problem. It's just the politics that gets in the way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that you've observed. I'm sure that everybody in the world can see that the US became what it was because of that individualism, because of that capitalism,
Absolutely.
that freedom system that built the
Yeah.
country through that industrial age. But then we had the wave of socialism that really started in the early 1900s here that has continued
Yeah.
progressively to turn us into the very same thing. I mean, our laws here are not very much different than say an England, a UK,
Yeah.
the very country that early on we declared our independence from, right? And that's just
Yes.
very interesting to me. If you look at the Heritage Foundation Index of Economic Freedom, you see the United States slowly but surely falling down that
Yeah.
list. And the countries
That
that
is
are near
extremely
the top
concerning.
are having just boons of amazing opportunity and amazing wealth and prosperity that they've never
Which is in
seen
no way
before.
surprising. Yeah.
And it's just we know the metrics, we know the choices that we can make. The problem is it's this political correctness that is
Hmm.
the foundation for bad ideas. And that brings me to my next part for you. And I want to just give you the floor because I saw this book and I'm going to buy it today and I'm going to read this thing because I'm so excited about it and what you have to say about
Thank
it
you.
is political correctness does more harm than good, how to identify, debunk, and dismantle dangerous ideas. Tell us about this book, man.
Yes, thank you. So you can see how my thinking started on this one. I mean, the genesis was watching the Ferrari and seeing how people sort of fell apart emotionally over that, and then discovering that in all of the answers that pertain to wealth, there is the politically correct version and there's the true version. There's what we're told in terms of sort of kindness, and there's what actually works in terms of lifting people out of poverty. Then the more you start to examine that and the more you pay attention to it, the more you see that political correctness affects more than just the economic world. It has become the sort of woke, progressive trend, social trends, and so on and so forth. And what I do in the book, the first part is actually quite academic. I trace political correctness from its genesis right up to today. So we are watching
Wow.
the news footage. I mean, a couple of months ago, we were watching the news footage of cities in the United States on fire, and people saying a mostly peaceful little fire, which is of course sort of an amusing take on it. And a lot of people around the world will look at these big events and say, "How on earth did this happen? What are these new trends? These sort of politically correct trends happening around the world?" And it is not new. It goes back some 200 years if you actually trace the history backwards. And in fact, the actual term political correctness, the first usage of that term by scholars, it was traced back to Soviet Russia in 1921. And when you know that, I would argue that that's about as much as you need to know about political correctness. We should
Absolutely.
already discuss it. right there, yeah. So it came from a news publication, government news propaganda publication of the likes of their Pravda, that kind of thing. And this was the first use of the words politically correct as an aspirational idea. In other words, something that you should do because it's the right thing to do. Now, in that particular case, essentially what it boils down to is this. If you have a tyrannical dictatorship, it is much easier to control a populace if they police one another. And that was the genesis of political correctness. It starts off by saying, here is what you may talk about. Then it progresses to, here is what you may not talk about. Then it gets to, here is what you are compelled to say by law. And finally, it gets to, and if your neighbor doesn't do it, report them to the authorities. So political correctness has a dark and ominous history. And it is always presented today as kindness, as upliftment of the poor, of essentially it's positioned as being a force that looks out for the smallest and most vulnerable minority groups. Now, I would argue that the smallest and most vulnerable minority group is the individual. And contrary to
Anne Rand would agree with you, actually.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd ask her, but she's been a while gone.
That's actually a quote from her. She actually said that very same thing.
Oh, did she? Okay.
Yeah.
You know what? I probably picked it up from her somewhere down the line. I mean, obviously, the thinking has infused my own worldview.
Yes.
Contrary to that, your U.S. Constitution, your Declaration of Independence, does or did the exact opposite. And this is something that I think possibly people don't sufficiently appreciate today. What it started with was this idea that you don't derive rights from a state, from a government, from a king, from a tyrant. It starts off by saying, we hold this to be self-evident that all men are created equal before God, and the individual is inviolable. And you start with that. After that, you can build a nation around it, but only insofar as it does not intrude on the rights of the individual. That is the exact opposite of the politically correct mob justice that essentially says the good of the group over the sanctity of the individual. So you pointed out that you've got this kind of conflict now between socialist tending laws in the United States. And I would say it is the exact opposite of what the founding vision of the United States was. And it was that founding vision that made it the most prosperous nation on earth. So these are interesting times for you.
Yes, absolutely. And it's, when you were talking about the freedoms, basically, the freedoms that we were allowed to have versus the freedoms that people in other countries are allowed to have, right? Is it truly freedom if you have to beg for it, right? That's really the biggest question. If you have to beg a government for your freedoms, is that really a freedom, ladies and gentlemen? That has always been so interesting to me. And when you read the Declaration of Independence and when you read the United States Constitution, the Constitution was designed to be chains on a government. The founding fathers, they hated government. Yeah. They wanted to keep chains on that government and keep that government in check, right? And then we've got the Supreme Court that later on comes out and it's supposed to decide matters of constitutionality, but all it's really seemed to do since the inception of this country is justify the actions, the unconstitutional actions of the federal government. And really, it just provides legitimacy for their continued bad ideas as time marches on.
Yeah, and Dr. Thomas Sowell refers to that as the quiet repeal of the American Revolution, which is a phrase that it gives me goosebumps. I saw a meme just a couple of days ago that said, what do we want? Freedom. Who do we want to give it to us? The government. What don't we understand? Freedom.
That's a perfect meme. That's so unbelievably perfect for what we're talking about here. Because your freedoms are you as an individual, right? They're not bestowed upon you by a governing body. They're not bestowed upon you by other people. Right.
Yeah. The founding idea of the United States was that exists in a relationship between the individual and God, and it's inviolable, and it's as simple as that. In fact, actually, just building on that theme, taking it one further, we're talking about freedom. How about freedom of speech? And people will counter with, yes, but we can't tolerate that which offends. Well, that's anti-science.
Here we go.
That's anti-science and it's anti-truth. unless everything can be vetted and debated and discussed, and even in offensive ways, you cannot arrive at a true scenario. And this is exactly
But you're
why I
a
said at the
science
beginning.
denier if you say that science isn't what they
Yes.
say science is.
Yeah. And this is why I said at the beginning, my perception is you have political correctness on one side and the truth on the other. And
That's
it's
a good
not actually
foundational
its
argument.
antithesis. Exactly that. Its antithesis is not unkindness or meanness. Its antithesis is the truth. And if you allow into this discussion, well, yes, you may have freedom of speech unless you actually stop right there and you say, no, freedom of speech must be absolute. Bring your ideas to the table and let's vet them. Now, here's where I go into specific detail on that one in the book. I talk about a guy by the name of Herbert Marcuse, and unfortunately, he's had quite an influence on American academia. And Herbert Marcuse's entire idea was what he called repressive tolerance or inclusion through exclusion. And that's where we get this idea that there are certain things you may or may not say. So this sounds a little complex, but I'll unpack it. His idea was essentially we must accept everything that accepts everything, and we must reject and deplatform anything that does not accept everything. So let's take that into practical terms. Let's say that science argues for one thing, but radical Islam argues for another. Well, radical Islam must be brought into the discussion, and science is being exclusionary. So guess which one must be kicked out of the mix? And that is the downward trending idea by which this entire mechanism works. It is anti-science. If you take a look at the simple structure of the scientific method, it essentially says all things are vetted until what remains is the contingent truth. Or in other words, bring every idea, bring all the facts, bring all of the arguments, bring your thesis, and we'll attack the living daylights out of it. Whatever survives is held to be the truth, contingently. Now, Herbert Marcuse goes in the opposite direction. It tends toward the lowest common denominator because you must accept everything that accepts everything. And that takes us into this whole strange clown mirror world of relativism and my truth and your truth and different narratives as opposed to the truth.
Yeah, interesting. And that actually reminds me of something that I call crowdsourcing your belief system. Right. So I know a
Yes.
lot of people who will say, well, I'm just kind of in the middle. You know, I want to take some viewpoints from both sides and all of this stuff. And it's like, that doesn't make you smarter. That doesn't necessarily make you smarter. That makes you just somebody who crowdsourced and took the popular opinion on every single thing you believe. Right. There's a reason I believe in capitalism. There's a reason I believe in gun rights. I don't know if you've got gun rights down there the same way we've got them here, but
no, it's we actually have a very interesting scenario in which it's very difficult for citizens to acquire guns, but unfortunately very easy for the criminals to do so. And we have one of the highest crime rates on the planet. So yeah, we're doing it wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And then people will talk about the government propping up certain people in businesses, like affirmative action measures and things like that, or forcing people to serve people that they don't believe in serving. We had those discussions in our country about the wedding cake baker for the gay couple and stuff like that.
Yes,
and I believe no matter what your belief system is, I think that you should, in a capitalist system, and capitalism will either reward or punish you, you have the right to be an ass. Right?
Yes, absolutely.
You should be able to say, I hate my customers and I don't allow anybody in here who is not, at least 5 feet tall. Because if you're shorter than 5 feet tall, get the hell going. We don't want you here.
Yeah,
right?
I serve hobbits only. Right? Yeah, absolutely. You should be free to do that in principle.
Right.
And the market will react accordingly.
And obviously he's just shooting himself in the foot.
Yes.
The bottom line of that idea is he's just shooting himself in the foot if he's excluding people and being that ass that I'm talking about.
Exactly that, yeah. So, I mean, the fundamental question there is, do you have freedom or do you not? And it's as simple as that. If you are not allowed to make decisions because of social pressures that are brought to bear by the mob, then you do not have freedom. And that's an interesting scenario in which to find yourself.
Yeah, and the mob mentality. I mean, you've got and Tom Woods. I don't know if you ever listened to the Tom Woods podcast, but I really love the Tom Woods.
I know the name.
He says that there's a 3x5 index card of allowable opinion out there.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
So anyway, guys, this has just been an absolutely fantastic chat. Douglas, I would be happy to have you on the show again. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Douglas Kruger.